In the Texas Territory, November 1873, the wind had a way of scraping everything down to the bone. The land, the houses, the people. It carried dust that tasted like broken promises, and every soul breathing it was in a struggle for something. In those days, honor was a heavier stone than love, and a family's name meant more than a daughter's silent cry. Gold was a rumor, but cruelty was a currency everyone seemed to have. And in a small, forgotten corner of this hard land, a young woman named Alara carried a secret pain, a word branded on her soul by her own kin. Barren. The word was a knife, and her parents twisted it every day. They saw her not as their child, but as a flaw in their legacy, a patch of useless dirt in a field meant for harvest. So, on a cold evening, when the sun bled out across the horizon, they made a choice. They sold her, traded her future to mend their own wounded pride. She was led away from the only home she'd ever known, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her eyes holding back storms that no one else could see. She was walking into nothing, a ghost before she was even gone. But fate, you see, it's a funny thing out on the plains. It watches, it waits. And in that very same territory, a lonely cowboy named Silas was trying to hold his own world together, a world with 5 small children, a world haunted by the ghost of his wife, a world filled with a sorrow so deep it had settled in his bones. He was a broken man, and she was a broken woman, and their 2 broken paths were about to collide in a way that would set the whole prairie on fire. Under the cold Texas moon, Alara walked with her hands bound by rope and her future bound by a handful of coins. Her parents' words were still ringing in her ears, a choir of cruelty. Useless, unworthy, barren. The words had chipped away at her spirit until only a hollow silence was left. They hadn't looked her in the eye when they made the deal. They had looked past her, at the men who were buying her, as if she were just a piece of livestock at the edge of town. Her soul had screamed, a silent, desperate plea, but no one had heard it. No one had cared enough to stop the transaction. As the wagon rattled away, the dust from her hometown rose up to choke her, each particle a memory of betrayal. She belonged nowhere. Love had abandoned her. Family had chosen pride over her tears. The men who now owned her spoke in low, rough tones. They didn't speak to her, but about her, as if she were a sack of grain, an object whose feelings didn't matter. A deal done under the cold, unblinking eyes of the stars. She lowered her own gaze, praying for a strength she wasn't sure she had, the strength to just survive until the next sunrise. The wind felt colder out here, the world emptier. Fear was a physical thing, wrapping around her heart like iron chains. But deep inside, in the part of her they couldn't sell, a tiny spark flickered. It was fragile, barely there, but it was alive. And it whispered a promise to her in the dark. This was not the end. Somewhere out in this vast, cruel wilderness, beyond the greed of her parents and the callousness of these men, a different fate was waiting. A fate that couldn't be bought or sold. A fate that would test her, yes, but would also show her a power she never knew she had. She pressed a hand to her chest, over the frantic beat of her heart, and made a silent vow. Though she'd been cast aside, though she'd been treated like nothing, she would endure. She would walk through this fire. She had to believe that even the barren soil of her own heart could still hold a seed of something worth fighting for. She couldn't see it yet. The night gave her no comfort, and her tears fell into the dust, unseen. But she held on to that faint light inside her, and it kept her breathing, kept her moving, kept her alive beneath the endless western sky. She was a prisoner, but the story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The wagon finally creaked to a halt in a town that was little more than a muddy street and a few wooden buildings. Lanterns flickered in the windows, casting long, dancing shadows. The sound of a tinny piano and rough laughter spilled out from the saloon. As Alara stepped down onto the hard-packed earth, her fate felt like a heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. The men grunted, tying the wagon and heading for the saloon, leaving her standing there like a forgotten piece of cargo. But she wasn't forgotten. In the corner of the dusty street, half hidden in the shadows of the livery, a man watched her. His eyes were different. They weren't cold or cruel like the others. They held a deep, quiet sorrow, but also a startling kindness. He was no stranger to loss. You could see it in the set of his broad shoulders, the way he held himself against the world. This was Silas. And clinging to his legs were two of his 5 children, their small faces pale in the moonlight. They were his shadows during the day, his silent tears in the night. He was a widower, a man whose life had been carved into a new, painful shape by tragedy. The town knew him as a strong cowboy, a man who could tame wild horses and work the land from sunup to sundown without complaint. But they didn't see the man inside, the one whose soul was worn thin, whose home was just a house, empty of warmth. His children ached for a mother's touch they could no longer remember, and as his gaze lingered on Alara, he didn't see what the rest of the world saw. He didn't see a barren woman, a piece of property, a family's shame. He saw someone whose pain was a mirror of his own. A woman marked by a betrayal so deep, it was a wonder she was still standing. She didn't notice him at first. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, a curtain of hair hiding her face from the world. But he felt a pull toward her, something he couldn't explain. It was as if the wind itself was whispering their names together, telling him that 2 broken lives were meant to meet on this very night. He stood there, his heart a mix of caution and a strange, restless hope. He imagined her quiet presence in his chaotic house. He imagined her gentle hands soothing the fevers of his children. He imagined her silence holding a strength his family desperately needed. But doubt was a powerful thing. Trust was a fool's game in a world this hard. Yet, the longer he watched her stand there alone, shivering in the cold, the stronger the pull became. This wasn't chance. He knew it in his gut. This was the start of something he could not, and would not, ignore. He'd seen 100 desperate faces pass through this town, men hardened by the sun, women broken by life. But he'd never seen eyes like hers. They were filled with storms, but behind the clouds, he saw that tiny, fragile light she was holding on to. His resolve hardened. Before another dawn broke, he would step forward. He would speak her name. He would offer her something she had been denied, a choice. And it wouldn't be a choice born of pity. It would be a choice born of the heart. As the wind howled a lonely song across the town, his 5 children slept in the small house at the edge of the prairie, dreaming restless dreams of a mother long gone. But their father, the weary-eyed cowboy, stood frozen in the lantern light, his gaze locked on a stranger. A stranger who might just be the answer to a prayer they had all forgotten how to speak. He took a deep breath. It was time. He was about to change his life, her life, and the lives of the 5 souls waiting for a love they thought they'd never feel again. Silas's boots made a soft thud in the dust as he stepped from the shadows. He pulled the brim of his hat low against the wind, each step deliberate, heavy with a choice that could not be taken back. Whispers followed him from the saloon porch, a chorus of doubt and judgment from the town's onlookers. But he didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed on Alara. She stood alone in the faint yellow glow of the lantern, a solitary figure, her spirit wounded but somehow, miraculously not broken. He stopped a few feet in front of her. The silence between them stretched thin and fragile, like a spider's web. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his voice was steady when he spoke her name. Ilara. He said it softly, not like a brand, but like a discovery. And for the first time since her world had been ripped apart, she looked up, and she felt seen. Not as a burden, not as a transaction, but as a woman. A woman worth more than the paltry sum her parents had received for her. The onlookers exchanged glances, their murmurs growing louder, sharper. Reckless, they called him. A fool. Why would a man with 5 mouths to feed tie himself to someone the world called Barren? Why take on another's shame? But Silas's jaw was set in a line of quiet defiance. He wasn't choosing her for what she couldn't give him. He was choosing her for what he could see she already had inside. A strength to love, a patience to heal, the courage to stand when life had given her every reason to fall. She hesitated, of course. Fear was a tide, and it was rising in her chest. But his eyes held her still. They were eyes lined with his own sorrow, yes, but they were also filled with a warmth that felt like a hearth fire on a cold night. She saw the truth in them. This man knew grief. He carried a loss as heavy as her own. The wind beat against the wooden shutters of the town, but the sound seemed to fade away, leaving only the steady rhythm of his words. He told her there was a place for her, not as property, not as a servant, but as a partner to walk beside him through whatever storms were to come. And something inside her, something she thought had died, began to stir. A trembling hope, fragile but undeniably alive. The whispers from the porch grew louder, the stares cut deeper. That's when he reached out his hand. He wasn't offering her riches or an easy life. He was offering her a chance to build something real, something that the world and its cruel words couldn't define. Her own hand shook as she lifted it. Her voice was just a whisper when she finally met his gaze. And in his eyes, she saw a man choosing her. Not with pity, but with a conviction that stole her breath. In that single moment, the iron chains of betrayal around her heart seemed to loosen their grip. She dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could grow in the most barren of soil. As she placed her hand in his, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. The judgment of the town, the cruelty of her parents, the harshness of the land, it all faded into the distance. This was not their story to write. It was hers, and his. Two broken souls, risking everything they had left for the chance to build a home where 5 small children were waiting for the warmth of a mother's love, and where a woman, discarded by the world, might finally discover she had never been empty at all. But what she didn't know, what Silas couldn't tell her, was that his offer wasn't just an act of kindness. It was an act of war. And by taking his hand, she had just stepped onto the battlefield. The house at the edge of the prairie was quiet when they arrived. Not a peaceful quiet, but a hollow one. The wooden walls seemed to hold the echoes of a laughter that had long since died. As Elara stepped over the threshold, 5 pairs of eyes watched her from the shadows of doorways and the corners of the room. They weren't curious eyes. They were the eyes of frightened animals, full of fear and suspicion. To them, she was an intruder, a stranger standing in the space their mother was supposed to be. Her heart ached with the weight of their silent judgment, but she tucked her own fear away, determined not to crack. But every move she made was a test. The simple meal of stew she prepared was met with cautious, distrustful glances. Every soft word she spoke was answered with a flinch or a stubborn silence. At night, she lay awake on a thin cot, listening to the floorboards creak and the wind howl, and she wondered if she had the strength for this. Had she just traded one prison for another? Could she ever hope to fill the void that a ghost had left in their hearts? But she was a fighter. She had to be. Slowly, with a patience she didn't know she possessed, she began to carve out a space for herself. She stirred warmth into the stews that filled their bellies. She stitched up torn trousers with careful, steady fingers. She whispered quiet prayers into the darkness when the youngest, a little girl named Sarah, coughed in her sleep. She didn't push. She didn't demand. She simply was there, a constant, quiet presence in their storm. One evening, as the fire crackled and cast dancing shadows on the walls, she told them a story. Her voice started out soft, hesitant, but grew steadier as she wove a tale of faraway stars and brave heroes who fought invisible monsters. and as she spoke, she saw a change. The guarded look in their eyes began to soften. Their small, tense shoulders started to relax. Their breathing slowed to match the rhythm of her words. In that moment, something shifted. A fragile bridge began to form across the chasm of their grief. The days that followed were still hard. There were scraped knees to tend, nightmares to soothe, bitter quarrels to calm. And the fear that she would fail them was a constant whisper in her ear. But her actions began to speak louder than her fears. Every wound she cleaned, every tear she wiped away, every rare smile she coaxed from lips that were too young for such sorrow. It was all weaving her into the fabric of their lives, slowly, painfully, one thread at a time. There were still days when the oldest boy, Caleb, would turn his back on her, his grief a wall she couldn't seem to climb. Or days when the middle girl, Leah, would cling to a faded portrait of their mother, her eyes full of silent accusation. But Alara didn't retreat. She stood her ground, offering not perfection, but presence, not promises, but consistency. And in these small, ordinary acts of love, the children began to find something they thought was lost forever: a safe harbor, a steady hand, a heart that chose them every single day. But there was a secret in that house, a darkness that had nothing to do with their mother's death. The children were not just grieving, they were terrified, and their fear had a name. One morning, Ilara was sweeping the porch when she saw a rider approaching. He rode a magnificent black stallion, and he sat in the saddle like a king. As he got closer, a cold dread washed over her. It was the man from the town, the one whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Elias Thorne. The man the townspeople both respected and feared. He was the unspoken ruler of this territory, owning the saloon, the general store, and, it seemed, the very souls of the people who lived there. He dismounted with an easy grace, his expensive boots making no sound in the dust. "A pleasant morning?" he said, his voice smooth as whiskey but with an edge of steel. He wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking at her, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. It was the look of a man admiring a possession. "I trust Mr. Silas is treating you well? I have a vested interest in your welfare, you see. A man must look after his investments." The threat was clear. She was his property, on loan to Silas. Silas came out of the barn then, his face grim, his hand resting near the axe he'd been using. The air crackled with tension. The two men stared at each other, a silent battle raging between them. Elias Thorne finally smiled, a cold, predatory slash. "Just a neighborly visit," he said, tipping his hat to Alara. "We must all look after one another out here." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a chilling silence in his wake. That night, Alara couldn't sleep. The way Thorne had looked at her, the possessive tone in his voice, it haunted her. This was more than just a powerful man. He was dangerous. She now understood the town's whispers, Silas's grim silence. Everyone was afraid of Elias Thorne, and for some reason, he had a special interest in her. She crept out of her small room and saw a light still burning in the main room. Silas was sitting at the table, his head in his hands. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. She hesitated, then walked over to him. "Who is he, Silas?" she whispered. "Why is he like this?" Silas looked up, and the sorrow in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. "He's the man who owns this town, Alara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "And he's the man who killed my wife." The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Silas's wife, Mary, hadn't died of a fever, as the town believed. That was the story Silas told to protect his children, the story he told to stay alive. The truth was far darker. Mary had been a fighter, a woman with a keen sense of justice. She had discovered what Elias Thorne was really doing. He wasn't just a wealthy landowner. He was a thief, a monster who used forged documents and violent threats to steal land from smaller homesteaders, accumulating a vast illegal empire. Mary had been gathering proof, writing letters to the territorial marshal, trying to expose him. Thorne found out. He sent his men. They made it look like an accident, a fall from a horse. No one questioned it. No one dared. To challenge Elias Thorne was to sign your own death warrant. Silas had been left with 5 children and a burning, helpless rage. He couldn't prove anything. He had no power. So he waited, biding his time, looking for a weakness in Thorne's armor. And then he saw her. Alara. He saw the wagon that brought her to town, recognized the men who drove it as Thorne's hired thugs. He knew Thorne had interests far beyond this small territory, that he bought and sold all manner of things, including people. When he saw her, standing alone and betrayed, he saw more than just a kindred spirit. He saw a chance, a dangerous, reckless, long shot of a chance. "I didn't just choose you, Alara," he admitted, his voice cracking. I took you from him. I knew it would be a challenge, a slap in the face he couldn't ignore. I thought it might draw him out, make him make a mistake." The truth hit Alara like a physical blow. The kindness she had seen in his eyes, the connection she had felt. Was it all a lie? Was she just a piece in his game of revenge? Another betrayal, sharper and more painful than the first. He hadn't seen her. He had seen a weapon to be used against his enemy. "You used me," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She felt the fragile trust that had been growing between them shatter into a million pieces. She was a pawn. She had always been a pawn. She backed away from him, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. She turned and fled to her room, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in the silence. She had been a fool to hope, a fool to believe this could be a home. There was no safety here. There was no safety anywhere. That night, she had the nightmare again. The same fragmented memory that had haunted her for weeks. A man's hand, adorned with a distinctive silver ring shaped like a coiled snake. A woman's scream, cut short. The smell of whiskey and fear. She had always thought it was a random terror born of her own trauma. But as she lay there, shaking in the dark, she saw the ring again in her mind's eye. And she realized with a jolt of ice-cold certainty where she had seen it before. Elias Thorne had been wearing that very ring when he stood on her porch that morning. The next morning, a heavy, unspoken tension filled the small house. Alara avoided Silas's gaze, the feeling of betrayal a raw wound. He had used her. Nothing he could say would change that. She was packing a small bag with what little she had, a change of clothes, a bit of bread, when the oldest boy, Caleb, appeared in the doorway of her room. He was a quiet boy of 12, with his father's serious eyes and a silence that was older than his years. He just stood there, watching her. "You can't go," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement. "There's nothing for me here, Caleb," she said softly, not looking at him. "I don't belong here." "You're wrong," he said. He stepped into the room and pushed a small, dusty wooden box into her hands. This was Mama's. Alara opened the box. Inside, nestled on a piece of worn velvet, was a collection of small, exquisitely carved wooden birds. Finches, sparrows, wrens. Each one was perfect. And one of them, a tiny bluebird, was identical to the one she had found under her pillow her first night in this house. The one she thought had been a warning. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Mama used to carve them," Caleb explained, his eyes fixed on the box. "She said everyone has a spirit bird. She said hers was a mockingbird because she had to learn to sing other people's songs to survive. But her real spirit was an eagle." He finally looked at Alara. "She told me," She told me before she died that I should only show this box to someone who had the eyes of an eagle, someone who could see the truth even when it was hiding. He took a shaky breath. Your eyes are like that. Tears pricked at Alara's own eyes. The bird hadn't been a threat. It had been a test from a boy who was desperately trying to protect his mother's memory. My father is a good man, Caleb said fiercely. But his heart is broken. He did a wrong thing using you, but he did it for the right reason. He did it for Mama. He then told her the rest of the story. His mother hadn't just been gathering proof against Thorn. She had found his ledger, the book that detailed every crooked land deal, every bribe, every crime. The night Thorn's men came, Mary knew they were coming for the ledger. She had managed to hide it just before they cornered her. She told me where it is, Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. I'm the only one who knows. She made me promise not to tell anyone, not even Pa. Not until I found someone with eagle eyes, someone brave enough to use it. A new, terrifying understanding began to dawn on Alara. This was so much bigger than her own pain, her own betrayal. It was about justice for Mary. It was about freeing this whole town from the grip of a tyrant. It was about these 5 children getting their future back. And then, another piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The nightmare, the ring, the murder she had witnessed. Caleb, she said, her voice shaking. It wasn't a land deal. The crime I saw, the man Thorn's men killed back in my hometown. He was a federal marshal. Now it was Caleb's turn to stare in shock. The marshal had been investigating rumors of a massive criminal enterprise, and he had been getting too close. Her parents, simple merchants, had been forced to supply Thorn's smuggling operations. When the marshal questioned them, they panicked. Thorn's men silenced the marshal, and Alara had seen it happen. Her parents hadn't sold her because she was barren. That was a lie to cover the truth, a story to explain why she had to disappear. They sold her to Elias Thorn. They handed the only witness to his federal crime directly to the murderer, a desperate, cowardly act to save their own lives. She hadn't been sold as a burden. She had been sold as a secret to be buried. And that's when she understood. Her testimony, the fact that she could place Thorn's men and his distinctive ring at the scene of a federal marshal's murder, combined with Mary's ledger, it was enough. It was enough to bring him down, not just in the eyes of the town, but in the eyes of the law, the real law, the kind that Thorn couldn't buy. She looked at Caleb, at the impossible hope dawning in his young eyes. She looked at the small wooden bird in her hand. Her plan to run away seemed like a distant memory, an act of a different, weaker person. She wasn't that person anymore. The world had tried to break her, to silence her, to make her believe she was worthless, but they had failed. Where is it, Caleb? She asked, her voice no longer trembling, but filled with a cold, hard resolve. Where did your mother hide the ledger? Caleb's answer sent a shiver down her spine. In the safest place she could think of, he said. The one place she knew he would never look. She hid it in his own office. The plan was insane, a fool's errand, but it was the only one they had. The ledger was hidden inside a hollowed-out book in the library of Elias Thorn's mansion at the top of the hill, a place fortified like a king's castle. Getting in was impossible. Getting out with the ledger was even less likely. But Alara had an advantage no one else did. Thorn still saw her as his property. A broken, pathetic girl he had acquired, and Silas had stolen. He would underestimate her. And that was going to be his fatal mistake. Silas, his face a mask of guilt and fear for her safety, was against it. But when he saw the look in her eyes, the same fire he'd seen in his wife's, he knew there was no arguing. The children became their silent co-conspirators. Caleb knew the layout of the house from the few times his mother had been summoned there. Leah, A quiet girl with a talent for mimicry could perfectly imitate the call of a screech owl, their signal. The two younger boys would create a diversion, a runaway goat at the far end of town to draw the attention of Thorne's few guards. The next night, under a sliver of a moon, the plan went into motion. Alara, dressed in a simple, worn dress, walked right up the long drive to Thorne's mansion. She was crying, her shoulders shaking, playing the part of the desperate woman who had been cast out by Silas and had come to beg for her master's mercy. The guards sneered but let her pass. Thorne, she knew, would enjoy seeing her crawl back to him. She found him in his grand library, sipping brandy by the fire. He smiled that cold smile of his. "So," he said, savoring the moment. "The stray returns to its owner. I knew that Cowboy didn't have the stomach to keep you." Alara fell to her knees, her words choked with fabricated sobs. She begged him to take her in, to let her work as a servant, anything to escape the harsh world. It was a humiliating performance, and every second of it fueled the cold fire in her belly. As she had hoped, he was too arrogant to see the truth. He was captivated by his own power. He told her to wait, that he would decide her fate after he finished his drink. He turned his back to her, looking into the fire, gloating. That was her chance. Her heart pounded as her eyes scanned the bookshelves. Caleb had described it perfectly. A thick, leather-bound volume of Shakespeare on the third shelf, to the left of the fireplace. Her hands were shaking as she pulled it down. It was heavier than it should be. She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers slick with sweat. Inside, the pages were hollowed out, and there it was. Mary's ledger. Just as her fingers closed around it, she heard the screech owl call, Leah's signal. But it was wrong. It was too soon, and it was frantic. A warning. A floorboard creaked behind her. Looking for this? Thorne's voice was no longer smooth. It was a low, deadly growl. She spun around. He was standing there, a pistol in his hand, his eyes burning with fury. The arrogant smile was gone, replaced by a mask of pure evil. It had all been a trap. "Did you really think I was that stupid?" he hissed. "Did you and that dirt farmer husband of yours think you could outsmart me? I've known he was sniffing around for years. And I knew the moment he took you in, he was planning something. He had been watching them, waiting for them to make their move. The diversion with the goat, the signals, he had anticipated it all." Alara's blood ran cold. She was trapped. She clutched the ledger to her chest. "A fitting end," Thorne sneered, raising the pistol. "You'll die for the same reason she did, for sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. I'll admit, she was clever, hiding it here. But not clever enough." He took a step closer, savoring his victory. "I'll kill you, then your Cowboy, and then those 5 little rats he calls children. The whole town will know once and for all what happens when you cross Elias Thorne." He was gloating, just like Silas said he would. He was admitting to everything. Murder, theft, all of it. He was so sure he had won. But what Elias Thorne didn't know was that the plan had a secret, final layer. Silas wasn't creating a diversion. He wasn't at the other end of town. He was right outside the library window. And with him was the one man Thorne never saw coming. The grizzled, weary territorial marshal from the next county over, a man whose brother had been the very same marshal Alara had seen murdered. Silas had ridden for 2 days straight to fetch him, armed with Alara's story. It had been a desperate gamble, but it had worked. They weren't there to fight. They were there to listen, and they had just heard a full confession. The library window shattered inwards as Silas and the marshal burst into the room, guns drawn. Thorne spun around, his face a contorted mask of shock and rage. He fired a wild shot that splintered the wood of the bookshelf next to Alara's head. Before he could fire again, the marshal's shot echoed through the room, and the pistol clattered from Thorne's numb hand. It was over. The king had fallen. Justice came swiftly after that. Thorne's confession, witnessed by a marshal, combined with the ledger and Alara's testimony, was an ironclad case. His entire criminal empire came crumbling down. The men who had worked for him, including the ones who had bought Alara, were rounded up. The stolen land was returned to its rightful owners. The town, which had lived under a cloud of fear for so long, could finally breathe again. The whispers that had once followed Silas and Alara were replaced with words of awe and gratitude. They were no longer outcasts. They were heroes. A week later, a letter arrived. The handwriting was shaky, tear-stained. It was from her parents. They had heard the news of Thorne's arrest and confessed their whole cowardly story to the authorities. They didn't ask for her to come home. They only asked, in closing, if she could ever find it in her heart to forgive them. Alara read the letter, then folded it carefully. Forgiveness felt like a distant country she wasn't ready to visit. But the burning hatred in her heart had cooled to a quiet ache. They were not her family. Not anymore. Her family was here, in this small house on the prairie. Her family was the 5 children who no longer looked at her with suspicion, but with a fierce, protective love. The day after Thorne's arrest, little Sarah had crawled into her lap and, for the first time, had called her Ma. Her family was the quiet, steady cowboy, who now looked at her not as a pawn or a partner in revenge, but with a love so deep and true it needed no words. The seasons turned. Laughter returned to the little house, chasing the last of the shadows from its corners. They were a strange, patchwork family, forged not by blood, but by choice, courage, and a shared fight for survival. Alara, the woman who had been sold for being barren, had given birth to something far greater than a child. She had given birth to hope. She had become the soil where an entire family and an entire town could finally take root and grow. She was no longer the girl who was sold. She was the woman who fought back. And in the heart of the Wild West, that choice, that fight, had changed everything. What do you think is the true meaning of family? Is it about the blood in your veins, or the people you choose to fight for? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss the dark secret we uncover next.